I am fortunate to have the opportunity tonight to introduce Dave Arnold, who is one of our keynote speakers. You know, Dave rode at WSU from 1984 to 1988, and this, coupled with his master's and PhD from UCLA in history, makes him uniquely qualified to write the history of Cougar Crew. We are indeed fortunate that Dave was willing to take on this project. He spent countless hours, and many in this room know, interviewing, writing, and editing what came to be an amazing account titled Pull Hard, Finding Grit and Purpose on Cougar Crew, 1970 to 2020, our 50 years. It was published by Washington State University Press in November, and we're pleased to have a representative of University Press here tonight, and thank you for being here. From personal experience, he got the story right. He got all my nicknames down: Bear, Care Bear, Sugar Bear, Aqua Bear, all the bears. And he captured that the people on this team over all the decades are authentic, driven, and genuine. David now teaches history at Columbia Basin College in Pasco and WSU Tri-Cities. We are so happy to have David here as a speaker, and we thank him for this amazing gift, capturing the history of Cougar Crew. So please join me in welcoming David Arnold, rower, teacher, and author, to the stage tonight.
Wow, thank you, Carrie. She said everything I was going to say. So, thank you so much to Rich and the program committee and Carrie and Danny and everyone who's here tonight. It is just amazing to be here. I just feel giddy to be here with so many people who I interviewed, some of whom I just met for the first time because I interviewed them during COVID, and we had this wonderful interviews and talked for an hour and a half. I'd never seen them until yesterday or today, perhaps. Or special shout out to Len Mills, who took the beautiful black and white photographs of the crew in the 1970s and helped me so much and was so generous with his rich photography. And he visited us at our home in Richland on Wednesday night on his way over, he and his wife, Lisa. And by the way, just want to say that he's selling or, auctioning a couple of his prints, and you should jump on that. They're beautiful prints, and they're aesthetic, and they speak to our experience. So thank you so much. When Rich invited me to speak, I told him unequivocally that I need between 30 and 60 minutes. Because I'm a college professor, I cannot say anything in less than 30 minutes. That TED Talk stuff is not there, no. My students who really don't care what I'm saying and who do not invite me to speak, they give me 60 minutes. Rich replied, "You have 20 minutes." So I'm going to try to make it work. I timed this, I wrote it down, I'm going to try to stay on point, but let me just say that I have not begun yet. I haven't started. This is all preliminary to my talk. So on my mark, we can begin right now. What I learned writing Pull Hard, Finding Grit and Purpose on Cougar Crew, 1970 to 1920 by David Arnold. I learned never write a history of people who are not dead. My first book was about dead people. Dead people don't contradict you or say things like, "That's not how it happened at all." Dead people don't tell you that you have chosen a horrible cover image for the book that shows a WSU crew rowing with less than perfect form. And unless you change the cover image, no one will buy the book, and the entire project will be a lasting embarrassment to the crew. I learned non-dead people can be a pain in the butt. But they also can be super helpful, especially if they care about what you're doing. The kerfuffle over the first proposed cover photo, and it's Linda Bathgate who's here tonight, the managing editor of the press, who's sitting next to me at our table. She knows well about the kerfuffle over the cover photo. It was just a small headache, and I think Linda and I were both grateful for it in the end, because the final product was that much better. Because people cared, and some people in this room, and some people who couldn't be here today, cared about the project enough to speak up and make it better. And they basically said, just show a picture of people that you can't tell that they're rowing with bad technique. That's how we resolve that. I learned that writing a book about crew is a lot like rowing. And yes, here come all the rowing and water metaphors. Sometimes things are flowing, occasionally coming close to approximating something like the mystical phenomenon that we call swing, although I can only guess at that. But mostly it's a lot of splashing and hacking at the water, like the 1980s lightweight alumni boat today when we won the Class Day regatta. I'm the historian. I think we mark that, put that in the record. Sometimes I felt, writing the book, sometimes I felt as if I had been miraculously swept up by the back eddy near the shore at Boyer. Those of you who rowed at Boyer know about that back eddy. It was pushing me inexorably towards the finish line. But mostly I felt like I was trapped in the middle current going nowhere. At those moments, I learned it was better to keep hacking away than search for the perfect stroke. At those moments, I was always uplifted by the people who I talked to, by their enthusiasm and support and willingness to talk openly and frankly about an experience that was central to their lives. At one of those moments, when I felt the project was doomed for the dustbin of history, and I wondered if I was wasting my time and energy, Danny Breivik reminded me that it didn't matter if this process resulted in a book or not. He told me, and I quote from my interview with Danny near the beginning of the project, he said, quote, "Even if it never becomes a book, Dave, it's a worthwhile process. Just the effort and the credibility that you're giving the crew, the questions that you are asking, and the process of having people talk to those questions, every part of that is a healthy part of the development and evolution of Cougar Crew. The book is not the only positive outcome of what you're doing, so you shouldn't dwell on that." That's what Danny told me. It was great advice. I learned about the infectiousness of Danny Breivik, and I learned why he was so instrumental in reviving the crew when it was at its lowest point. Danny reminded me that I should focus on the process and not the outcome. Of course, it's just like rowing. If I focus on one stroke at a time, eventually I will take a stroke that pulls me across the finish line. I tried to remind myself of this constantly because I was constantly nervous that the final product would not be worthy of what we have all accomplished here. Rich Ray told me early on that I carried a great weight on my shoulders to accurately portray the history of Cougar Crew, which has meant so much to so many. I would be the bard of Cougar Crew, etc. My blood pressure rose immediately. And with all due respect to Rich, who offered me incredible sage advice throughout the project, I realized that if I really thought that way, I would be paralyzed. I learned that I was not going to make any progress until I let go of the pretense that I was writing the definitive history of Cougar Crew, The best I could hope for, I kept telling myself, was to assemble some selected stories into a comprehensible narrative. If people read it and said, this isn't how it happened at all, they would be correct. A book is not real life. It is a tidied up story that represents only a small sliver of the complex, messy, three-dimensional experience that we all lived. And yet, I could not shake the nervousness that I would, for example, misrepresent the story of Paul Enquist. I fiercely wanted to write something that would do justice to Paul's story in the same way that David Halberstam had done for Tiff Wood and John Bigelow in his book, The Amateurs. I thought, this will be the amateurs for Paul. So I labored, I interviewed all these people, including John Bigelow. I spent hundreds of hours. I visited Paul at his summer home in Crescent Bar. And then when I sent the chapter to Paul, it was like nothing. Silence. I didn't hear back. Yeah, he was probably out fishing or something, but of course I'm thinking he hates it. So first, I'm thinking, what does he hate about it? This part, or is it that part? And I'm going through all these scenarios to the point where I'm moving from insecurity and fear to outright anger now. Now I'm mad at Paul because he hates it. And he's not grateful for all my hard work. And I'm conjuring up all the things I'm going to say to him, and I'm mad now. You know what? Fine. Maybe I'll just yank the entire chapter. Cougar Crew is more than Paul Enquist, you know. So after a week of silence, I write another email to Paul. I'm pissed off. And I say, Paul, have you read the chapter yet? Paul replies, yep, I'll send some changes. He hates it. Another week passes. I revise the chapter, changing my usage from Paul to Enquist on a recommendation from Dave Amy. I send another email. Paul responds, here are the changes. There's just a few things. And then Paul says in his understated way, amazingly accurate. And I learned why Paul Enquist is a gold medalist, right? And is completely like a rock, as Brad Lewis says, unperturbable. And I learned why I am not a gold medalist like Paul or Chris. Just a little too high-strung, just a little too insecure. Harry, how was my row today? Am I going to make the boat? How did my backsplash look? In the end, Paul was a tremendous help. And not just in his chapter, but throughout the entire project. Everyone was eager to help me, and I'm not going to name names. So many of you are here, and unfortunately not all of you are here, including Paul and Mike Clear, and so many people that helped me, but I have stated all those people in my acknowledgments, and I really encourage you to get the book, read the acknowledgments. The book's for sale back there, by the way, and I'll sign it for you. And all proceeds, all royalties go to Cougar Crew. So you're helping out the crew when you buy the book. And we've got copies. Did I mention we have copies? I'll sign them for you. I learned, ask for help and you shall receive it from the Cougar Crew family. I learned, in fact, that you shall receive sometimes more help than you ever bargained for. I learned from Mike Clear, for example, about the physics of rowing. If you don't know Mike, you should know that Mike Clear has a PhD in physics. I learned from Mike that one sentence that I wrote in the first draft about stern check was incorrect from a physics standpoint. And I learned this thoroughly with an essay-length email, complete with footnotes and links and many hours of conversation thereafter. I learned that Mike Clear loves rowing and physics and Cougar Crew. I learned that rowers in the 70s had a lot of fun. Wild parties, mustaches, long hair, bell-bottoms, cowboy boots. I'm not naming names, you know who you are. They told me stories that were mostly unpublishable in the book. I didn't want to get anyone arrested. Like Gene Snake Action Patterson told me today down at the Shell House, she said about her era, she said, what happened at the Shell House stayed at the Shell House. I learned that Chris Norelius is a Cougar and is a Husky. Both things can be true at the same time. Both things can be true at the same time, as it should be, since, and I'm going to say something sacrilegious to dyed-in-the-wool Cougars right now, in this room, Cougar Crew, we are all Cougars and we are all Huskies.
Go Cougs!
Why? Because our program was founded by Huskies, supported by Huskies. Ken Abbey, Dave Pratt, Bob Orr, Dick Erickson. If you don't know what I'm talking about, read the book. I learned, writing the book, remember that's my theme. I learned there was a lot of hijacking in the 1970s, the golden age of hijacking. I learned this by keyword searching the word crew in the Daily Evergreen database to find a lot of sentences like, quote, the hijacked Boeing 727 was carrying 147 passengers and a crew of 8 when it landed in Havana. To go through a lot of that. I learned to not believe everything you read in the newspapers, especially if it is the Daily Evergreen. I mean, not to be too disrespectful, but I learned while reading the Evergreen that I was the public relations officer for the club in 1986-87, something of which I had no memory, but there I was, quoted, saying things that I'm sure I never said. Quote, it was really rough. Water was breaking over the bow, and the boats ride really low in the water, said crew member Dave Arnold. By the 1,000-meter mark, they were up to their waists in water. Really? Their waists? I learned that we should truly value that we are a club, as challenging as that seems sometimes. I learned that a varsity athletic program is not just, quote, the same thing but with money. And that as someone who during my rowing days would have welcomed varsity status and all the financial support that comes with that, we should be careful what we wish for. And I think this banquet is testimony to the power of our voluntary association of Cougar Crew, our club. I learned, and I know that rowing invites cliches, but it is what it is. I learned that we are all so privileged, as Griffin said last night, to be here. We're so privileged to have had the experience of rowing together on the Snake River. And I don't mean that in a scolding way, like we should check our privilege. I mean that in a way that expresses gratitude for having been able to be a part of Cougar Crew and have the tributary of that experience flowing into the larger stream of our lives. Yes, another water metaphor. I want to see more young people have the experience that we had. Grit seems like something we can all tap into. Just buck up, keep a stiff upper lip, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Is that even possible? I learned that it's not so simple. In order to have the opportunity to find grit and purpose on a college rowing club, you have to have the basics covered. It's hard to row while you're working 40 hours a week to pay for tuition, or if you're battling economic, emotional, and family instability. Paradoxically, we all understand that rowing can be a treatment for those ailments, which can heal our bodies and minds. This makes it even more imperative that we work to extend this experience to more and more students who can benefit by rowing in boats in a remote river canyon and clearing their minds and suffering with their teammates. Most importantly, I learned that Cougar Crew really is like a family. We may disagree sometimes, but we'll always share the common experience of growing up together in the Snake River Canyon. We are all different, but something common drew us in, animated us in the same way. By going down to the Snake, we achieved a common experience and we formed a community. We learned cooperation, we learned grit, and we were all changed by that experience. It gave us more confidence, like Carrie was talking about. It gave us a sense of ourselves as people in the world. Perhaps it did set us apart in some way. There was that sense of shared identity. Tribalism is usually a bad word today because it's most often associated with tribal hatreds and xenophobia. But becoming part of a tribe is also about finding one's people and realizing that there can be a greater notion of tribe that brings people together who do not necessarily share the same religious or political views or class or ethnic background or gender or sexual identity. Rowing in Cougar Crew for me was similar to what I experienced working in the canneries in Alaska, or what my dad experienced serving in the military in the mid-1950s, where diverse people were thrown together and they worked together and they realized their commonalities despite their differences. They shared common struggles and common sacrifice, and so they bonded. And they can leave that experience behind, but they would always be a member of that tribe. And a simple reunion like this one would lock them right back into place. Thank you.